everyone. Welcome back to the Got a Case of Wanderlust podcast. I'm your host, Lydia, and today I am here with a special guest. His name is Mark. And Mark, I found you through Thatch, which is a travel planning guide sort of website. And I found your guides for Tangier and Chefchaouen because I recently traveled to Morocco. I was kind of just browsing to get some background research. And you have a lot of experience in this country at this side of the world. Um, and like, side note, I found your guide for a bakery tour in Copenhagen. And I went to Copenhagen and I agree with all the bakeries you listed. I was really impressed because all of my favorite places were in your guide. So I trust your judgment. um, do you consider yourself a foodie when you travel?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And it is funny because one of the things actually I was talking to Lydia right before we started filming this, and I just got married a few weeks ago. And actually my wife and I are in the process of trying to move to Copenhagen. So the bakeries are absolutely a huge pull for us, and being able to get a cardamom roll every day is an important part of life. But yes, I'm absolutely a foodie.
Absolutely.
I think food informs travel so much. One of the things I love, especially being a foodie, is being able to see how high-end food and how traditional, even street food, reflect each other, right? And being able to go to a restaurant and see how they would transform something basic, or I'll call it quote unquote basic. And for that matter, how sometimes the low and the mid range takes these sort of high end flavors and high end spices that we sometimes affiliate with being at a fancy restaurant and
Mm.
incorporates a lot of the same flavors just in a very different manner. And for me, I think being a foodie is the best part of travel, if you ask me.
Oh, 100%. Food is one of the main reasons why we travel, is it not? Um,
Oh,
so so Copenhagen, you're one of the main reasons you're thinking about is from the bakeries. That's totally something I would do as well. But right now you're based in North Carolina. So can you talk to us about like what sparked your wanderlust? You grew up in the United States. Like what drew you to traveling to kind of the opposite sides of the world?
yeah, so growing up, I grew up in New York. As I talked to Lydia before this podcast about that. So growing up in New York is such a melting pot. And I think when it's right next to you, it's really hard to appreciate all the things that New York has. So growing up on Long Island, adjacent to New York, about an hour train ride into Midtown Manhattan, I was able to see a lot of different restaurants and different ethnic groups and different neighborhoods and all this high-end culture and museums and shows and all these things that, quite frankly, I think you don't appreciate it until you don't have it in front of you. But I think really seeing that from a young age sparked a lot of interest in culture and in a lot of engaging with different culture, whether that be through the arts, whether that be through food, whether that be through language. So as I got older, I really got interested in traveling and experiencing the culture. My family always prioritized travel, but we didn't necessarily prioritize international travel as much. But as we got older, that was something that I had the privilege to start doing and start traveling to Europe and learning little tidbits of languages along the way. And I think by the time that I became older and I didn't have a mother who, quite frankly, was a little bit scared of traveling to maybe your off the beaten path destinations, I was full to the horses in terms of getting started and seeing some of those more unusual places. And I've, over the last 10 years or so, had a wonderful time traveling and seeing all of these very different places.
Mm, that's really refreshing to hear that an American didn't like experience any hesitations from the media, like from the media's portrayal about uh, just cultures different than ours. I think there's a lot of stigma around places like Morocco, for example, a lot of African Muslim countries, for example. So it's really great that you didn't allow that to deter you and to let your mom scare you because it's a very normal thing. It's a very common held perception in America. So, like, how, like, your first travel experience to a country culture very different than yours, do you remember kind of how it surprised you, how it defied maybe preconceptions you had about the place?
Absolutely. So I think it's good to give a little background about myself and what I studied. So in university, I studied Arabic throughout. And I started from day one. Like my first class of freshman year in university in the United States, I was learning Arabic. And this is something I really learned to love. So my first real opportunity to travel internationally on my own was through my university through a 3 week study abroad program in Israel, Palestine. And my university had this very kind of unique situation where they had a compound in East Jerusalem. So pretty much right on the center, if you know anything about kind of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right in the middle of kind of the crossroads of Israeli and Palestinian life. And I remember my first trip over there, just how, I mean, it's hard to say because when you look at these places, especially through any political lens, it's a dizzying place, both culturally in terms of diversity, but also just in terms of how the politics intersects with the actual location. But I remember in terms of traveling, one of the things I was very surprised at was I'd say how tight life is, right? And I think how dense life is in other parts of the world. So you go into a market and you just see how close things are. I think we see it in Europe to a certain extent, but I also think Europe is so much more organized than other parts of the world. And when you go into the Middle East, is a really great example. I remember even, in my time spent in Jordan, I had to get used to not queuing at the falafel shop because all the locals would cut me because we did not use a line. That's not part of the culture. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? That's how they do it. But I think this idea of how people can still get to the same outcome, right? They still go and they shop for their clothes and their food and all these things, but do it in such a different way than we do here in the US. I think that it's a basic thing, but it's something, at least for me, that I think really stuck out.
Mm. Wow, I can't imagine how impactful that first trip was, considering how different it must have been coming from the US. So, what inspired you then to want to be a travel planner? Because you currently do that part time. On your website, it says you've been planning since 11, planning vacations. So how has your travel planning like evolved with time? Like, what kind of like was your inspiration and process?
Yeah, I think one of the things us as travelers always strive for is for unique experiences. And I think because I have been able to navigate specifically the Middle East and North Africa, but other parts of the world as well, I think Middle East North Africa can be a very challenging place to navigate. Language barrier is a lot larger than it is in, say, Europe, I find. There's a lot of safe countries to visit, but it's often hard to make sure you find the safe places, or even in countries, I think Egypt comes to mind, where um, sometimes Egypt is really safe, sometimes it isn't. It goes back and forth a lot. And when it's very safe, it's a wonderful destination. But when it's not safe, probably shouldn't visit. So I think for me, travel planning has been a great opportunity to try and share some of my knowledge, some of my expertise on these regions that A, are a little bit less visited, but B, also offer these amazing experiences, amazing history, amazing culture, amazing people and hospitality, some of the best in the world you'd find in the Arab world. So, and to answer kind of the second part of your question, what kind of my approach is, one of the things that I have really, really tried to do as I've gotten older is be responsible with travel, and particularly trying to engage with local businesses. One thing that I love about traveling in the Middle East and North Africa is it is extremely easy to find locally owned, say, boutique hotels, or locally owned restaurants, or locally owned tour providers. These allow for a really great opportunity to know, A, that your dollars or whatever currency you're bringing in is going to the local people, which is ultimately the most important thing, I think, in terms of responsible travel. But also, it gives you an opportunity to see really authentic experiences, right? To be able to go in and have to have good local staff running your hotel, still while still staying in a really nice setting in Morocco. That's something I love. The Riyadh scene in Morocco is phenomenal. And you can find amazing hotels that are really not that expensive relative to what you'd pay in Europe or the Americas. And they still be fantastic with amazing hospitality. I think those are the things, at least, that I really try to focus on and to understand, how do I responsibly travel, but also how do I responsibly engage with the culture?
Hmm. Two extremely important questions, and I wish more travelers kind of had that mindset. I think it's becoming more popular, this concept of responsible travel, but still, like, so many people do resort to the resorts and the hotels and eating at chains because it's what they're used to, it's what they're familiar with, it's more comfortable. But I mean, part of the beauty is really getting out of your comfort zone, right? Going back to like researching and specifically researching safety because there's so much information out there, like what's safe, what's not, and safety is very subjective and often misconstrued by the media. So how do you decipher like whether somewhere is truly safe?
Well, so I think the first piece I'm going to say is just a general stability piece. I would normally tell people ask me because I would say I'm pretty accurate, but that's a little bit unreasonable for a lot of people to do. So I think probably the best source, I always recommend looking at like a State Department website. I actually don't recommend the US State Department because I find they're a little more conservative in certain jurisdictions. I actually find the Canadian State Department to be a little more accurate. And I can't remember if it's Canada or the UK, but they have a really good map feature where you can literally just kind of scroll through and see, what's a green zone, what's a yellow zone, what's orange and what's red, which would basically be very safe, take some precautions, be careful regionally, or don't travel, respectively. So that's usually a really good start. And then I think the second kind of step is a combination of talking with locals when you're there and also just searching things on the internet, understanding safety. One thing that I always do when I start to plan a trip is I actually like looking up on Wiki Travel, which is basically Wikipedia for travel. And they always have a stay safe section. And people will give their unsolicited advice on safety in a given location. Is it accurate? Not always, but it's a good start in terms of understanding, what are your risks in a place, right? Is the risk that I'm going to be subject to mugging? Is the risk that I'm going to be subject to scams? Is it just that it's really safe, but I might get sick from the water, right? Is there nothing for me to worry about? Every place is a little different. Every place has something dangerous to worry about, right? It might not be big, but there's something to at least consider. And I think that's at least how I try to approach it.
Mm, okay. Those are some resources that I haven't heard of, so thank you for sharing.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
what lessons have you learned with travel planning throughout the years?
I think the thing that I am always trying to learn, and I think this is as a planner a really hard thing, is to try and be flexible. So an itinerary is always a starting point. It's not the end point. So the start for me is always the important thing is what do you want to do, right? You should, at least in my opinion, I know some people would disagree, but I always think there needs to be at least some plan so you can prioritize what's a must see, what sounds good, and if you have some extra time, what would you be interested in doing? And I find that's the most important thing for me with traveling, and that you don't need to plan every single minute of every day. But you also need to make sure that you're flexible with things because things go wrong, things don't always pan out, right? Sometimes that restaurant you want to go to is closed. Sometimes I remember when I visited Morocco, actually, we were going to go do a hammam treatment, and the hammam we went to was having issues with their water that day. So we literally had to go and try to find another hammam or reschedule for later in our trip because that was an experience we wanted to have. So I think when it comes to planning, understanding that this is just about prioritizing what you want to do and make sure you do those must sees, right? If you're going to go to Jordan, you're going to want to go to Petra and Wadi Rum. Of course, that's your must see. But if there's other things beyond that, make sure that you try to prioritize, but you don't need to do them. That's, I think, ultimately, from a planning perspective, that's how I look at it.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's really great advice. I think it's essential to know the kind of traveler you are, and that just comes with experience. I think just knowing yourself because everyone wants a different travel experience, and sometimes that doesn't always mean doing the most visited attractions or whatever in a destination. That's okay. Like, there's so many places I've gone, and I haven't gone to the most famous museum, for example. In Paris, I didn't visit the Louvre. Um, but yeah, like envision the travel experience you want and plan ahead, plan accordingly. Um, about balancing spontaneity with planning, can you recall a moment or yeah, a moment of serendipity, you could say, in your travel memories that just wasn't planned for?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that comes to mind that first pops up was from a trip to Morocco. So we were taking the bus from Marrakesh to Ouarzazate. So you travel over the Atlas Mountains. It's about a 4 hour ride, and then we were on our way to Ait Ben Haddou, which is this really famous. They call it a qasr. It's this big mud brick village that they've kept restored. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Um, so we were on this bus, and the bus, as most buses do, took a stop 2 hours in for people to use the bathroom, to get a bite to eat, whatever it was. And we stop in this village in the middle of the Atlas Mountains. And I see across the bus some guy with a truck with an espresso machine in the back of it, serving up coffee. And I'm like, man, this guy's gonna have good coffee. So I get off the bus, I cross the street. It was like 2 dinar, maybe 1 dinar for a coffee, which I mean, or dirham, I should say, in Morocco. Which, if for those in the conversion rate, I mean, you're talking 10 cents. It's well less than $1 for a shot of espresso. And I remember that being one of the best coffees I'd ever had in my life. Just sitting there, like, man, I'm so happy that I got off this bus and went to this little truck. But I think even the Middle East and North Africa, one of the great things is people are so welcoming. People will host you for lunch. They will literally just invite you into things. And one of the things I think that's really tough as a Western traveler is that we're either really naive or we're almost a little too uptight about scams. And I think in the Middle East and North Africa, unfortunately, that is one thing that people do need to navigate, especially in some countries. But trying to balance that spontaneity to say, this is someone being hospitable, right? Like it's important to say, yes, I will have lunch with you because you're offering and you are doing such a great gesture. And no, you're not just scamming me, sort of thing. I think having that sort of balance is a really important thing. And it's something I'm not great at, but it's something I try to work on. And when I try to plan itineraries for people, this is something I always try to stress.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like, I totally experienced that my first trip to Morocco, and again, it's something that comes with practice, learning to trust your intuition to decipher, like really like who feels trustworthy and who you just get bad vibes from, and you should always go with your gut instinct. But at the same time, I was super like skeptical first arriving to Morocco. Like day one, I didn't like if people said hi to me, I would just walk straight past, like no eye contact. Especially as a female solo traveler, like I am programmed to be more cautious. But towards the end of my trip, I found myself saying hi back to people who said hi. So just engaging more towards the end and realizing that most people have good intentions. Most people are good. Um, and the hospitality of Morocco is one of the main draws, like why I fell in love with the country and why I definitely want to go back. So that's also very good insight. Would you say there's certain types of travelers that are easier to plan for than others?
Think so. I think specialty travel always gets challenging, right? People who want to, do nature treks, let's say, is one thing that I find that's a really hard thing for me to plan. One of the things that I usually try to step in is to try and find reputable tour providers because at the end of the day, going through nature and going to see those things, they're fantastic experiences, but it's really hard. So even to put this in like a Middle Eastern and North Africa context, going out to the desert, I had the opportunity to visit Erg which is out kind of by it's one of the main dunes in Morocco. So you'd basically take the road from Marrakesh until it ends, and then you go off road another 2 hours. And I would never recommend for someone to do that on their own because it is a challenging drive. If you don't know how to off road, if you don't know how to deal with the GPS. So for me, those are hard experiences to plan on your own, not to mention when you deal with nature and things like that. There's always different rules. Like I even think I recently went on a trek through the Andes in Peru for 4 days, and it was a wonderful experience ending at Machu Picchu. But that's one of those where you do that. There's so many rules. You can't do that on your own because there's so many rules. And how do you navigate it? you can't without knowing what you're doing. So I think for me, that's a challenge. But at the end of the day, the goal is to find the right tour provider more so than actually me planning it themselves. Whereas if you go to a city, I can plan that 100% for people.
Okay. And would you say your travel planning process is similar for you versus when you do it for other people? Or is it just depends?
Think so. I think it does depend, and I think there's a difference between people who say I want to go to a place and I just want to see the best things a place has to offer, and someone who says I want to go to this place and I really like this. I think that's often the thing because sometimes if you say I want to go to Istanbul, what's the best things to see or something like that, you're going to give a list and you're going to have all of these, historical attractions and some other things, right? And that makes sense, right? Because you're not going to go to Istanbul without seeing the Hagia Sophia. That would be a waste, right? Whereas if someone says, I want to go somewhere and my interests are this, right? I don't like this. I think that's when things get a little bit different. Because for me, I love doing everything. So if there's something to do, I want to do all of it. And not everyone travels that way, and that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think being akin to that is probably one of the more challenging parts of travel planning.
Right. And then just some final questions. After traveling so extensively, what city called to you the most that you could think off the top of your head? Like, where have you felt the most aligned?
So it's interesting because there's a couple that come to mind. So I have spent some wonderful time in Amman and Jordan. It's kind of my first time really living on my own, actually, was in Amman. And that's something that I think I hold really true to me. It's funny because a lot of people who live, especially expats living in Jordan, will joke and call it the Hashemite kingdom of boredom because there's not a lot to do. And Amman very much feels that way. For a city of 5 million people, there's not a ton to do. It's still worth visiting, but people, you visit for a shorter trip, right? But I always felt very at home. That almost there was such a little boredom that there's a little bit like it feels just like home. So that's I think one place I've really enjoyed being, and the other place that comes to mind is actually a place you visited recently was Tangier. Tangier is just this beautiful mix of Spanish, French, and Moroccan culture all wrapped up into this beautiful city. It really is kind of the best of the Mediterranean all in one place. So I think for me that's probably a top pick as well.
Yes, Tangier was like absolutely magical, so special. And then, okay, so my rapid fire questions are usually three. You already answered the first, which is a special place in your heart. What is a dream destination for you?
So I'm going to be going on my honeymoon in a few months, and I'm going to be going to Bhutan. So that's actually I'm very excited for that one. That's one of these places it's really hard to go to. So having to have this opportunity, I think is going to be absolutely awesome.
Wow, that's incredible. That country sounds amazing. Well, I wish you the best with your honeymoon. And then last question would be like, what's a memorable meal you've had?
So I am going to go with probably my favorite restaurant I've ever been to was a Peruvian Venezuelan fusion restaurant in Lima, Peru called Merito. It's hard to even describe just how good the food was. Everything was phenomenal, and these fantastic kind of weaving of modern things and with more, traditional elements, right? I like my now wife was with me. She got a pork belly arepa, which is not something you think about in a fine dining setting to have an arepa, but it was one of the best things like she's ever had. And I had these. I remember having this delicious sort of. It was like kind of a raw fish. Think not quite ceviche, but like going down that route on this sort of Andean cracker of sorts with like a little gel of something called sacho tomate. That's it's kind of like a sour tomato of sorts. And I think for me, that's the meal I really think about. I'm like, yes, that's probably my favorite restaurant I've ever been to.
Okay, asache tomate. That's such a fun
Delicious.
word. I've heard very
Yeah,
good things about Peruvian cuisine. Haven't never
yeah,
been to Peru, but that's definitely on the bucket list as well. Okay, thank you
absolutely.
so much, Mark, for sharing all your wisdom. Is there anywhere specifically we can connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a blog. It's markstravelrex.wordpress.com. And I also have a Thatch shop that Lydia alluded to at the beginning. That should be under Mark Fedoronko, with some of my free guides and also some of my paid guides and my travel services as well.
Perfect. I'll link that in the show notes. And yeah, it was very nice talking to you, Mark. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Lydia. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much for listening to the Got a Case of Wanderlust podcast. Again, my name is Lydia, and you can find me on social media in the About section of this podcast. Please rate and review if you found value or insight from this, and I hope to see you in the next episode.